you are really Kevin's real fans, because of course the Warriors are playing now.
Right.
So this is a self-selecting audience. I thought I might have to introduce you, so it's good that I don't. But I read The Inevitable this week, and actually I read it in a really interesting setting. I was in Tassajara, which is one of the last places that is not connected to the internet. So I read about this book, which lays out a world in which everything is connected. And I was thinking about sort of, who Kevin is, and I came to, I think, yet another idea. You'll have to tell me if this works, because we know he's a journalist, he's an editor, cyber explorer. In Tassajara, I decided you're a travel writer, and you're probably the best travel writer about traveling in cyberspace.
That's how I began. Did you know that?
I'm not sure. In cyberspace?
No. I started reviewing travel guides for the Whole Earth catalog, and I got a gig, got invited on to the Eyes Network. I was going to write about it as if it was a new country. And then in 1984, I did a cover story for a New Age journal called The Network Nation, which was this new continent as if it was...
That's great.
So
okay, you're still at it.
I'm still at it.
Because, that's what came across me, being off the net.
Right.
This is, I sort of dived into what the net is, and he really is extremely observant, and so I commend it for that. But I want to actually start somewhere else, and that is that this book was not published first in the United States.
Right.
It was, as I understand, published first in China, and I don't know if you want me to bring this up, but I'm going to. A while ago, Kevin sent me a photo, and it's a young Chinese woman standing next to him, and she has Kevin Kelley tattooed on her arm. He is a rock star in China.
Right.
So what's going on there? Explain this to me.
I wrote this book, my first book, called Out of Control, which was published in 1984. I wrote it basically in the early 90s. It was about artificial life, decentralized systems, how machines were becoming biological, how you could have these internet-like things, really before the internet came along, or before the web came along. And it was pretty much ignored in general, because it was a little too early. People didn't really understand what the relevance was, but it was talking about how you had kind of social media, how you had all these things working in a user-generated way. But it came out and it was translated in it was crowdsourced translated in China about 5 years ago. And it came out right at the moment that there was a couple of Chinese entrepreneurs like Pony Ma, Jack Ma, who read it. And it was very influential to them in forming their ideas about what they could do on the internet. And they've talked about the book.
But now, why did you publish this one first in China?
Okay, so what happened was, I finished this book, writing it a year ago, about today, completely finished, done. I turned it in. I want my publishers to publish it. They said, "This is fantastic. We're going to accelerate this. This should be out in a year and a half."
The U.S. publishing industry.
Right, and so the Chinese said, "Oh, this is great. We'll have it translated and published in October." I said, "That's good." So I didn't really want them to do it first. It's just that they were doing it at a reasonable speed.
Step back, and what does that say about Chinese society versus our society?
That it's running faster. I mean, you were just there. The acceleration, you can kind of feel the acceleration. You can go somewhere and come back 2 years later, and the entire block is gone, and another thing is there. I mean, Shenzhen, which we've heard about, this kind of manufacturing center in the world, is as big as New York City, 20 million people, and 20 years ago, there was really literally a fishing village, so it's entirely brand new. Everything is less than 20 years old. They've built it up. And imagine building New York City in 20 years. It's just, that's the speed that we're going.
You'll also sell more copies of your book in China?
Oh yeah. So it's like, I think it's sold close to 500,000 copies in China.
Yeah.
So it's there's a bigger audience, and they are book readers. They're not on to the Kindle yet. For some everything else, I mean, they're far more advanced in the social media, living on the phones, ordering food, ordering everything, but they still buy paper books.
That's interesting.
They go into bookstores.
Yeah. This is not about me, but one thing, Kevin helped me recently get a visa to go to China, because as a New York Times reporter, I can't work in China. but I had a book, and so I was able to get a 10-day, one-entry visa into China. You have a, what, a
10-year, I have a 10-year
yeah,
visa.
open-ended visa, so I'm
Right,
a little
right.
jealous, because China is remarkable. It was the most remarkable week of my life in some ways.
Right.
The intensity, I mean, let's see, so 4 million new companies in the last year, 1.7 million tech companies.
Right, right.
I mean, the scale is just...
Well, there's a statistic that Bill Gates was touting about, which is the U.S., since its founding, a couple hundred years ago, has poured 7 billion tons of concrete. The Chinese have poured 6 billion tons of concrete in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
That's the scale at which they are transforming. So they're doing 200 years of progress in 2 decades. And that's why it feels very, very crazy in terms of that kind of acceleration. It does a lot of tearing of the traditional structure, and I think it's not very stable in many ways.
My publisher was very proud of the fact that they published the first book on big data in China last fall. It sold 1 million copies in paperback.
Exactly.
I mean,
Yeah. You're in the wrong business. Right?
But then every once in a while, your point about social media, it's just remarkably how far ahead they are in us. My publisher, as a marketing organization using social media, their sophistication dwarfs the American publishers. I mean, it was staggering to me. But every once in a while, there's this little sort of twist, and you realize this is not a democracy.
Right.
That's like sort of not a priority for them, or what is it about their culture that?
So I think John's asking, like, do they go to China really a lot? I mean, I go there for long periods of time. I'm going not just to the East Coast cities that everybody knows, but I spend as much time in the country, far, far from the big cities. And even there, the society is being transformed. And I also am married to a Chinese, so that's part of the picture here. But there's a Great Wall where everybody knows that there's censorship. But what's interesting about the censorship is that most of the censoring is done by college students who are hired, who don't really want to be doing the censorship. They're doing as little censorship as they can possibly do and still keep their job. Which to me is a sign that this is a very unstable thing, because as soon as there was any hint that things were going to tilt in one direction, they immediately stopped censoring. Right? Because they're not doing it for any ideological reasons, they're doing it because it's a job. And more, I hear, and the thing that has shocked me in the last, say, year, I interact with lots of millennial, entrepreneurs, young kids who want to start their own business, party officials, the state-owned CEO, minders, and everybody's been critical of the government, including the people who work for the government, which again suggests to me that this is not long-term stable. Because the issue is not like the higher-ups. The issue is like if you have potholes in the street, there's no accountability. There's nobody in charge. Nobody can complain to about getting them fixed. There's no apparatus for appeal. There's no apparatus. So it's those little things that actually, the pollution, the fact that you can't point your finger and say you're in charge of it, get it done, fix it, or we throw you out of office. There's none of that, and so that is very frustrating at this point.
It's into the future. It's Blade Runner, and then you'll walk into, like, my hotel room, a supposed 5-star hotel room. I walk into the bathroom, marble everywhere, and a sign in English under the water tap: "Water not potable." There's just these things that sort of set you.
Yeah, right. But I think it's worth talking about in this context because the things I'm talking about in this book, the inevitable trends, I think apply in any culture. It apply, I think, even on any planet, because I think they're rooted in the physical physics of the very technology that they come out of. So I'm saying that on another planet you'd have an internet. As soon as you have electricity and chips, you're going to have an internet. That's inevitable, and these things are inevitable in China or in Russia or in the U.S.
So before we get to the book, one more question, sort of macro question. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to remember, maybe it was after, not Out of Control, but
New Rules.
No, well, at some point you told me you'd written your last book, and it was
Yeah.
definitely before. What happened?
Yeah, that was this book. I have 3 kids, 19, 25, 27. They're not reading books. Their friends are not reading books. They grew up without TV, so they're not watching TV. They're hardly watching movies. They go, sometimes on Netflix. What they're spending their time on are watching YouTube videos. This endless barrage of all kinds of stuff. And all their friends are the same. And so I decided that more people have seen my TED videos than will ever read my books. And I spent all of maybe 4 hours thinking about the TED video, and years working on the book. And I should reverse that. I should spend a couple of years working on these amazing videos and then have the book cut as an afterthought. So it's just a matter of, I want to be where the attention is, and the attention, despite the fact that we're in the bookstore, is really in this media for the younger generation, and that was my thinking. Is that I want to communicate these big ideas in a form that the culture is going to listen.
So is this like a business card in a sense for getting you out there?
Exactly right. As you know, the economics of books are in the speaking. I make my living speaking in China. Right?
Yeah. That's a. Well, I know I've watched that. I mean,
yeah.
There is a circuit. You've run the circuit. It's very lucrative. Well, let's get to the inevitable. So define what you mean by inevitable, because obviously when I first got into it, I had one concept, which is my sense of the word, and then I came away with maybe you meant soft inevitability or subtle inevitability or something slightly different.
Yeah. So there's the hard form, which is that, if you rewind a tape of life, you play it, you end up with people twittering every 15 seconds, no matter how many times you do it. And that's not what I mean. I mean that I think these technological systems that we've made, that we're surrounded by, these very interdependent, complex webs of technologies that are supporting each other. I mean, you can't make a chair unless you have a saw. You can't make a saw unless you have a hammer. You need all the things to make all the other things. And that these large systems have certain biases, leanings, recurring patterns that are independent of what you're actually doing with them. They just lean in certain directions. And that leaning is a kind of a direction. And that direction is something that's predictable. It's predictable because we can see it. And the way I look for these directions in these technological systems is looking at how they are misused, abused, or unsupervised. Like with kids, outlaws, or the street. How things are actually being used, not how the people designed them to be used, but how they actually are being used, because that tells you a little bit more about how it's biased, how it's likely to go, because nobody's kind of trying to steer it at that point. And for me, the kind of easiest example would be very early on, when the internet was first coming about. You were there, and the first thing we noticed is that there was this propensity of it to copy things, right? Indiscriminately copy. It was very easy. Anything that could be copied, if it touched the internet, would be copied. And there was the underground. I mean, the file share. There was all this kind of stuff was coming out, and you could see it, that there was this ingrained, leaning urgency to copy things, because I think it's built into the very nature of it. When a message goes across the internet, it's being copied many, many times and forwarded. So I like to say, so there was a bias towards copying. Copying was a something that I'm leaning to. It's like gravity. It's like a force. It was just pulling it in this direction. And if you were to try to make a business or anything, you'd have to kind of accommodate that copying. But then we have the music industry and the film industry, and the music industry in particular, who was going to try to stop the copying, copy protection, all this kind of technologies that would prevent copying, or legislation and laws that would outlaw it or ban it or arrest people, your customers who were copying. So they were working against the grain of that general drift. And so I would say that it's inevitable that you have copying in any kind of a system like this. It's inevitable in the sense that it is biased, it's a force that draws it towards it, in that sense. And the thing that I want to say about it is that it's at a high level. So while the large scale force or trend or urgency of this is predictable because we can see it, the particulars, the specific instances are not predictable. They're unpredictable, they're contingent, and they make a huge difference to us. So the way I would say it is, the internet was inevitable, and I would say that on any planet in the galaxy you go visit that has electricity and wires, they're going to have an internet. But the character of that internet is not predictable. Whether it's international, national, private, open, closed, how it's regulated, those are not predictable, and they are incredibly important to us, and we have a choice. So the genre is inevitable, the species is not. So a quadruped on Earth, quadruped animals, quadruped robots are inevitable, but like zebras are not. The telephones system was inevitable, but iPhones are not. They're not predictable. So I'm saying that the kind of large end, it's a general leaning or tendency that is something we can identify.
Would you quarrel with McLuhan? We design our tools, they shape us. How does
I
that
would not
fit
quarrel with that. That's a larger discussion, but I think that we humans, that we invented our humanity. That we're the first animals that we domesticated. And that, and we have lots of evidence even genetically for that. I mean, we invented this thing called cooking, which was an external stomach, so that we could digest food that we couldn't with our natural stomachs, and then additional nutrition changed our jaws and our teeth and our biology, and we became very dependent on it too, for long-term fertility. So that that's something of mind, it's a technology we invented that changed us. Very quickly after domesticating herding animals, we developed adult lactose tolerance to digest the milk in certain populations very, very quickly. So we have a lot of evidence of our own genetic changes due to the fact that we have these inventions. And actually, our genetic evolution, surprisingly, is actually speeding up right now. There was Stephen Jay Gould and others kind of imagined that once we made culture, we transmitted through culture, that we stopped biological evolution, but it actually turned out not to be true. We're actually biologically evolving even faster than before. So I would say that
attributes that you see on the horizon.
Well, things like wearing glasses and vision, and your teeth are a lot more crowded and stuff. But I think that that's just at one level. But I definitely think that the things that we're making with these screens and these technologies will definitely shape us. I mean, shape us in the most fundamental way, not just rewire our brains. They did some studies of some peasants in Peru or Bolivia, where in the very remote areas, and they had a control where their lives were identical, except for one thing: some of them could read and some could not. And they were doing brain scans, and they found out that the people who were literate, even though they had identical lifestyles with these others, their brains actually worked differently. They had rewired their brains through the years and years of reading and writing. So it's very obvious to me that the time we're spending in screens and the time we'll spend in VR will definitely rewire our brains.
Have you seen that research on taxi drivers and the knowledge?
No.
So the MRIs show that their cerebellums get much larger.
Yeah.
So obviously that's going to go away. So.
Exactly. But so I'm a little bit. I mean, I think we have a different kind of intelligence and knowledge. I think all this surfing and flitting and quick dipping in and out, I think, is a different kind of knowledge and approach. I think it's very appropriate to the environment that we have. It seems it's distracting, but I think it actually is a very proper response to this very fluid and overwhelming environment that we have. I don't think it's like a frivolous, playful thing. I think it's actually a very adaptive stance.
So you do it in the form of a series of verbs.
Yeah.
But before we get into that, I want you to talk about your method. I mean, when you take a project like this on, how did you do it? I mean, do you see yourself as a reporter?
No. So I'm a reluctant writer. You may call yourself a writer. I don't call myself a writer.
I call myself a reporter.
Reporter, okay. I call myself an editor. I'm a natural editor. I'm not a natural writer. the way I write things is I will have an idea and I'll try to find someone else to write it. But that's what editors do, right? You make assignments. And I'll have an idea and I'll try to get other people to write it. And then I'll try to give it away. And if it's I can't give it away, then okay, it dies. Then the idea comes back. That was a really good idea. I'll try to give it away again. And I keep doing that. And if I can't give this great idea away, that means I have to write it. Which is really good because that means nobody else can write it.
Kevin just recently gave me an idea, actually. I didn't realize that was the...
Exactly.
It's a good idea.
I know. Now I don't have to do it. So I will write things that I have to write, and also I will write things as a means, an excuse to find out. So I recently did like this Wired VR story, and it was simply that I wanted to know about it, and what better. So I write in order to find out what I think. I don't know what I think until I try and write it. I think I know, and then I write it. I start to write. It's like I have no idea. I mean, I don't know what I think. So writing for me is a means to force out, for me to get access to what I think. And so VR was telling me, it's like, I don't know what to think about this. I don't know enough. I don't have any opinions about it. So I'll take the assignment or give myself the assignment basically, and I will spend 5 months doing this investigation, trying to figure out what I think about it at a high level, because I'm not interested in the specifics. I'm interested in the long-term, bigger pattern. And that's what I'll come away with, and if I'm lucky, I'll get paid to do it.
I consider that reporting. I mean, one of the fun things about reading your book for me is I kept stumbling across nuggets.
Right.
I mean, which were obviously reported. I mean,
it's reported. I guess that's reporting. Yeah, I mean, yes. So I try to do reporting. So I do a lot of speculation. I do a lot of. I'm a born theoretician. I like theories, but I like to have them reported on facts, something concrete. So I'm always looking for concrete. And by the way, I have a full-time researcher that I employ to help me dig up those quantified facts.
I'm jealous.
It was the first thing when I left Wired. I said the thing that I want was a personal research librarian, and I've had one for 12 years, and it changed my life.
You also create language. You create words.
Reluctant.
Do they stick?
That's a good question. So I invented this word technium. I have no idea if anybody else is using it. I do it. I don't like to do it. I do it only if I really feel I have to. There's a word in this book called cognification, cognify, which I didn't make up, which is an English word, but I'm using it in maybe an unconventional way, which means to make smarter. But what's the alternative? Smartify? to smartify something? And smarten it? Smarting? So for me, I wanted a word that means to make smarter. So I call it cognifying, to cognify something. And maybe it'll stick. I know that's a very unpredictable path.
Well, it takes us in a certain direction, because one of the things that surprised me on the book is that you said, but didn't pursue really deeply, that you were skeptical about this popular idea in Silicon Valley of the singularity.
Yeah.
You backed away from it, but you didn't really...
Well, that's because I spent a lot of time in the previous book talking about it. And also, that was why I did do a big defense of what I meant by inevitable, because that was basically the entire previous book. I didn't want to repeat it. So the singularity, just in brief for my stances, I think there's two versions, kind of the hard version, which is the term borrowed from physics, which means you can't see beyond the border of this horizon called the singularity. It's completely unknowable. And we would get to that by making an AI that's, quote, I'll come back to this later, quote, smarter than humans, and that could then invent an AI smarter than itself, which could invent an AI smarter than itself, and you get to this cascading, runaway snowball, this explosion. It's called intelligence explosion from good. And that would happen faster and faster, and from our perspective, it would appear, when it happened, to be instantaneous, and it would reach infinite knowledge. And the first thing it would do was cure cancer, make us immortal, and resurrect Ray Kurzweil dead. right?
And keep Ray alive.
And keep Ray alive. So the whole thing, what you want to do is you want to live until that moment, and then you live forever. So Ray is, Professor is taking 250 pills a day to make sure that he lives to that moment.
I believe he's recycling his blood too.
Well, okay. So I don't believe that. That just seems to me improbable on many, many, many levels. But I do think in a soft version of it, which is that I think that it's very probable that we are making a large machine superorganism. We're making something really big by connecting 7 billion people together.
Which I call the holos.
Which I call the holos. 7 billion people and all the machines and everything that we've made together, and that there will be something that will begin to emerge that we may not be able to even perceive because it's happening at another level. Just like if we were neurons in this big world brain or whatever it is, our neurons are not aware of our thoughts. We may not be aware of this. There may be a singularity in that respect. So it's not as if there's a little tiny AIs that are making, it's just that there's an intelligence that may be beyond us. And actually, 3 years ago with David Eagleman, a neuroscientist, I launched something called, you've heard of SETI, right? The Search for Internet Intelligence. I started something called the Search for, Search for Aliens. Yeah, this is the Search for Internet Intelligence. If there was intelligence to come out, what would it look like? What is their criteria? What would be evidence that would convince you that there really was this emergent intelligence? And what would that be scientifically? And what I discovered was that SETI is actually not looking for anything intelligent. They're not looking for intelligence. They don't know what intelligence is. They've given up that long time ago. They're just looking for strange signals. They don't have a definition of intelligence, and this is what we'll make it back to.
Your idea, I mean, I have to, did you read Arthur C. Clarke's a short story called Dial F for Frankenstein?
Long ago when I was like...
Yeah, so, which he takes that idea down the path, and of course, enough interconnections and the world comes alive. The problem is it's a 1-year-old.
Right.
And it does just random stuff. And,
right.
Jets take off, guns fire.
Yeah. I think we should be ready for that.
But where are you on the pace of technology? I mean, at a certain point, you sort of, as an aside, you sort of assume Moore's law will continue indefinitely. And I become
opinions about that.
I'm a big skeptic. I mean, I sort of have to. It's a sort of a show me. This is the religion of Silicon Valley. But the cost per transistor of silicon hasn't changed for 2 years, and that's pretty damning indictment at the point where things should be going vertical. If they're flattening out, something else is going on.
So I had a whole, in the previous book, I had a whole chapter on Moore's law and whether it was inevitable. And actually, my inspection of Moore's law was that the definition of Moore's law was constantly being changed as it went along. And that's what we're going to do, is we're just going to redefine it and retrospectively and go back. And so, so the effects of this kind of progress may continue even though Moore's law may stop, is what I suspect. And so, but I think it's a really good question, which is what if this effect, whatever we call it, stopped? Because everything, so I was asking myself, would any of these trends or forces that I'm talking about, would they continue if that Moore's law thing stopped? And it's a really good question, and I think the answer is, I believe that it would.
Well, the way I try to frame it is, we're thrown back on human creativity,
right,
which is episodic. It's the free ride is over,
right.
But it's not to say that we won't have huge breakthroughs or significant accelerations.
Yeah.
One of the things that's striking about your book is your optimism, and I started as an optimist too.
You did? I don't believe that. When you were an optimist?
About the internet. I was firmly a member of that community that believed it would be a Barlowian utopian abode. And then I was beaten over the head by cybersecurity for many, many years, and I now sort of come to feel that the internet is simply a mirror for everything good and bad in the world. It's a much more sort of nuanced view. But you do sort of address the question of optimism at a couple points.
A little bit, but see, here's maybe the difference is I was never a utopian about the internet, but I was always optimistic about it. So I'm not a utopian, and I talk a little bit about that. Utopian being that we come to the state where there's the eradication of war and poverty, and there's this sort of harmony maybe. So I'm what I call a protopian, which means I believe in progress. and where things are a little bit better than tomorrow than they were yesterday. And so I think that we are kind of creeping to improvement. It's a really slow creep. That we make, probably on average, we create maybe 1% more than we destroy every year. So that means that there's 49.5% of what we see is crap and terrible and harmful. 50.5% is really good. That 1% is almost invisible to many people. And so, but 1% compounded annually for a century is civilization. That's all. I think that's all you really need. You just need a tiny, tiny bit better than before. So I believe that. So I am an optimist because of history. I think if you look at history and you actually look at the data and the evidence is absolutely very, very clear that progress is real, and that would suggest, because that's if you're going to be based, if you're evidence-based, that would suggest that it's going to continue. Now it doesn't have to, but there's more evidence that it will continue than it won't.
I'm going to open it up a little while, but I wanted to dive into one area. You talked a little bit about the time spent on virtual reality, which you really did an exhaustive tour, and it comes off very well. But sort of a couple of threads here. One, you talk about sort of the screenful nature of the world. You call it screening, but we are the people of the screen. You say at one point. There's screens everywhere, and yet we both visited Magic Leap. And one of the things that Ronnie Apovitz says is he's intent on destroying the Asian display manufacturing industry, which is a tremendous claim, and one that I would have thought was entirely science fiction from the world of Vernor Vinge until I went there. Mm-hmm. And then I thought, well, okay, this is possible. And then I was reading in your book, I know you sort of have this aside that in 1989 you thought things were going there then too, and never mistake a clear view for a short distance, right? So where are we?
So just to explain, the Ronnie Apovitz, the founder of Magic Leap, which is a version of VR that's called mixed reality. So there's kind of two basic types: the VR, virtual reality, which Jeremy Lanier kind of, I think, coined in late 80s, that we probably both saw, and I was very excited by it, where you put a goggle or glasses on and it blocks everything out, and you are transported to another world, and it actually does work. It really does work. Then this other version where you wear clear spectacles that can overlay a virtual thing or a virtual person into the environment that you see, whether it's this room or an office or your home or maybe even outside. And that mixed reality is actually technically the more difficult of the two, because if you can do the mixed reality, like here, then you can do the VR just by blacking it out, making it all dark, turning the lights down, and you have VR. So that's a much more difficult thing to do. And his premise is that he wants to do this so you can put on a pair of glasses and you can see virtual screens anywhere you wanted to. And again, it works pretty good. I watched a high definition TV screen inside Magic Leap VR, and it was perfectly clear. I could read on virtual screens. I could read very small type. So the idea would be that you wouldn't have to buy any screens because you could just wear them with the do this, whatever, and you move around, and it does hand gestures. So that's the premise, and I think that's I think that's a very viable path. But my experience with technologies is that the new ones rarely displace all the old. It's usually additive. The general pattern is that we add the things to the existing. So we would add this in addition to all the other screens that we're doing. So, I mean, if you look around, most of the technology in this room is old. It's very old, particularly this room with the books. Okay? But I mean, it's we have screens and the books, and so I would expect that there would be these virtual screens as well as the physical screens.
And yet, look at how quickly the iPhone came into the world. I mean, that's sort of a striking example of your. I mean, it's ubiquitous, right?
Right.
So you could see by that argument if that it could go away just as quickly.
No, I don't think it goes away. And this is the thing: is it can arrive very quickly, but it rarely goes away.
So, something else could become ubiquitous.
Yes.
So I walk down the street in San Francisco, and I swear to God, half the people are walking down the street lking at their palm.
Right.
That cannot be the end of user interface.
Right.
That can't be the final step. Something
Exactly.
has to come after.
Right, exactly. And I think that user interface is actually going to be sign language, gestures, and voice. I think if I had to do I worked on the Minority Report movie with Spielberg, and if I had to do a futuristic movie and had people using the computer, say in 50 years from now, this would be it. This means that you're talking and you're doing this, and there's all kinds of stuff. This is you talking to your computer.
Yeah. Unless there's a neural interface.
Right, and there could be.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, what people don't realize is the Obama Brain Initiative. Their goal is not only to be able to read from a million neurons simultaneously, to write to a million neurons. And I mean, that's not science fiction.
But you've probably tried on those brain things, and you can control a cursor just by thinking about it. That does work.
Yeah. So a last area, you didn't talk about it, but I mean, one of the things that you say, just sort of out and out, just as a statement, ubiquitous surveillance is inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe not the form, but talk about it in the context of the iPhone and this debate we're having in our society. Do you come down on one side or the other of it?
Yeah. So let me just kind of clarify or talk about what I mean. So just as I would say that the internet is sort of the world's largest copy machine, and it wants to copy and will copy and you can't stop copying, I think this thing that we built is the world's largest tracking machine, and it will track, and anything that can be tracked will track. And I think it would be very difficult to actually stop it from tracking. So just as we had learned to kind of work with the copies and try to make that work, we have to work with the fact that this is going to be copying everything. So it's, I as Bob mentioned, I was involved in starting the quantified self movement, which is self-tracking. So we're tracking ourselves. Our friends are tracking us with the Facebook tags when they take your picture and tag you. Companies are tracking us, governments are tracking us. And I see no counterforce in the next 50 years that works against more increased tracking of things. By the way, virtual realities are, well, if a smartphone is a surveillance device that you pay for and carry around yourself, then VR is a total surveillance world that you voluntarily enter into, because every movement that you do, in order to convey your avatar there, all your movements, expressions, and everything have to be captured, and therefore are being tracked. And I would predict that some of the biggest data companies in the future will be VR companies. And so far, the companies that have the most data are the biggest companies. So I suspect that this idea of, which is very difficult to track in real life, but very easy to track everything, your hesitation, what you're interested in, where you're looking, your expressions, can all be captured in VR. So I'm just saying, I think that this is massive in terms of the tracking, and what we have to do is what I would call civilizing or domesticate the tracking, as I said, we have some choice. It's inevitable that the tracking happens. It's not inevitable what we do about it, and I have some suggestions about what to do about it.
So there's a political argument that, yeah, I think I just turned it off by pushing the wrong button. My background.
There you go.
Yeah. That we should control our own data, behavioral data. Do you think that's impossible?
I don't think the idea of owning data makes any sense to me.
But Google has created a stack where they in effect own or control this behavioral information about you and me.
Right. So I think, I mean, this is a larger.
You gave some startling numbers. One of the, just out a little bit. Let's see. It costs, you say, Google about a third of a cent to do a search.
3 cents to do a search, and they earn 20 cents.
They 27, I think is what.
Yeah, 27. Right.
Yeah, that's
astounding. Yeah. So they're making money. I mean, that's another thing about our human attention. The fact that if everything else is abundant and the only scarcity we have is human attention, we should be charging people to read their ads or to watch their ads. And I think that's going to be a really huge flip when we do that, because you disintermediate the advertising agencies and they'll just pay you directly for your attention. But the thing about the data is, I mean, we're being surveilled and we're being tracked in ways that we don't even know. I was shocked to find out that when you send a letter to the U.S. Post Office, the front and back of every letter is scanned. digitally scanned and stored.
You can't turn around. My favorite one of the moment is there are a dozen private entities capturing license plates in
Yeah,
Oakland.
exactly.
What's that about?
Yeah,
I
exactly.
mean, Repo Man, I understand digital Repo Man, but
Yeah.
that can't, there's other stuff going on.
Right, if
obviously.
you have a fast track thing, your location is
Yeah.
being scanned. So there's a whole list of the routine tracking that we already have, and this is going to happen more. And for me, the agenda is to civilize it. And I propose one idea is what I call covalence, which means mutual surveillance, a mutual valence where we are tracking those who track us. We know what they're tracking. We know we can have some accountability. They're accountable for the accuracy. We can change it, and most importantly, we get direct benefits for that. Otherwise, they're tracking us. We don't know what they're saying. We don't know what they're tracking. We have no accountability, and they don't give any benefits, and that is really tolerable. So it's this idea of symmetry, bringing symmetry back into that. So the cops should be wearing body cams, and we should be filming the cops, and we should have access to that. So there should be a mutual symmetry to all that kind of information.
We're about 45 minutes, 50 minutes in. Why don't we open it up to questions from the audience?
That would be great, and I will bring around a microphone.
There's